pottery wheel and immediately be good at it. In fact, I would be quite alarmed if I saw someone jump on the pottery wheel that had never done it before and then just got it. I've seen a lot of students in this process. I will say that almost all the time it feels a little bit chaotic when we're first learning, and then what we'll do is just practice as much as possible to sort of feel why things are feeling chaotic, what we can do to sort of feel like we have more control over it, and hopefully by the end of the 5 weeks be able to sit down at a pottery wheel and say with confidence, I'm going to make this, and be able to do that. But all this to say, if when we sit down at the wheel it feels a little bit strange, that's normal. We're all gonna learn together. What we'll do today is I will demo on the wheel, and then we'll each take a turn on the same wheel, and we will each watch as each person does that. I know that can also feel a little bit nerve-wracking. When I first started teaching here and they told me that that was the method that we used, I was like, oh, that sounds a bit intense, but I have found it's actually amazing to be able to watch 5 times someone doing the process. It really helps versus just watching it once and then just going to your own wheel and kind of trying to figure it out. We'll also see some of the most common mishaps over each person trying it, so it's really helpful to learn from each other's mishaps or mistakes or whatever you want to call them. So that's how we'll do that today. And then over the course of the 5 weeks, we will always be practicing on the wheel, either throwing or trimming, and then on the last day, we'll all glaze our pieces together. So it's the exact same clay that you use in hand building. It's called M340. Same thing. What will be different is that on the wheel, we'll use a lot of water compared to in hand building where you kind of want to not use as much. So that part will be quite different. So basic setup of the wheel, we have our speed pedal, which will spin the wheel. We want our wheel to be spinning counterclockwise, which means it should be on these wheels in the reverse position. Yeah, so there's a switch right here. It says forward and reverse. We'll put it in reverse. You can always just check by the way that it is spinning. We have these 2 things that we'll put in to make sure that we catch the water and slip that will be inevitably flying off of the wheel. So for positioning, I am almost 6 months pregnant, so this is not an ideal how you would be positioning, but if that's not the case, you want to get as physically close as you can to your wheel. So that means you're gonna have your body positioned as close to the wheel as you can so that you can have your, if possible, elbows resting sort of in your hips and you're able to use your whole body in the process of throwing on the wheel versus sitting far away and having just your arms be doing the work will be very inefficient for some of the things that we'll be doing on the wheel. So you want to be really as close as you possibly can. Also because then as you lean forward, you can look straight over what you're doing and look onto the center of the wheel and see your work versus your vantage point if you're back here will be quite different. So I will constantly be telling people to make sure that you're sitting close to the wheel and to keep your elbows down. We don't want to be working like this. You'll see when I'm centering specifically how much my whole body will be helping me do the process. So we will each get our 2-pound lump of clay. It will look a bit like a potato after we've finished wedging it and sort of smoothing it out. One important thing will be to make sure that we have a rounded bottom. Reason for that is I'm about to throw this onto the wheel head and then I'm really going to seal it down. If I had this, you know, something like this going on the bottom, then there could potentially be air pockets between our clay and the wheel, which would prevent us from really creating that seal that we want to make sure that when we're then using force to center our clay, it doesn't just fly off the wheel, which if it happens, you will not be the first one that happens to by any means, but that's one way that we can avoid that. So, like I said before, as close to the wheel as you can, and then we're going to just slam our clay into the center of the wheel. And then I'm not spinning the wheel with my foot, but I'm just taking my hands and with my palms kind of at a 45-degree angle, I am clapping downward to really seal the clay to the wheel, kind of get this volcano looking shape. Then I will slowly spin the wheel and just take the side of my fingertip and seal it down. That's just to make sure that there's no gaps. So you can see right here, there's a little bit of air between my clay and the wheel. We want to just seal any of those gaps. And once we have it totally sealed, now we're ready to center. So that whole process we did without any water. Reason for that is we don't want any water to get underneath our potato of clay and also inhibit us from getting this good seal on the wheel and could keep it from, or could cause it to slide off. Now that we have it sealed to the wheel head, now we're going to use lots of water. You don't want there to be any friction between your hand and the clay. So if you're putting your hand on it and it's kind of sticking or you feel that friction, you definitely need more water. A good rule of thumb that you can use is if the clay looks matte, which right now it does, it's probably too dry. Whereas when we have water on it, it will look glossy, and then we don't have any friction between our hand and the clay. So you can see right now when I am holding my hand on the clay, there's a wobble. It's pushing my hand away at some points because it's not perfectly centered on the wheel. So what I want to do is center it. You can kind of think about centering as getting rid of the wobble. So theoretically, once I have my clay perfectly centered, it shouldn't be pushing my hand away at any point because it'll be in the exact center of the wheel. So I'm going to pour some water on here, and then I'm using my left hand as much as possible, tucking it in to your body, and then you're pushing away from your body with this part of your hand, forcing the clay to stay in the center of the wheel. You can put your right hand over the clay, but you can also just use your right hand right here, sort of bracing your left hand. The work is coming from what's happening right here. So I'll do that so that it's easier to see. And we're just pressing. You can see how much my body is actually leaning into what I'm doing. And you can see that that wobble is going away as the clay gets centered. So I think it's really satisfying to sort of like watch it get centered, watch the wobble go away. Centering can be tricky when we're first learning, just getting a feel for how much force you want to use, but just try to keep in mind, like think about how much my body was really doing the work with me and not just my arm trying to push forward. So once we have it centered, meaning that it's not pushing my hand away at any point, then we're ready to do what is called coning. It's also what you see a lot of times in like movies about pottery. I don't know why, but it seems to be what they like to show a lot of times. So first we will cone up. We'll use both our hands coming together and then squeezing the clay upward into a cone. And then we'll cone down. So if we're coning up, we're just have both hands on either side, and we're just putting even pressure while moving up so that we force the clay upward. Can you see over there? Okay. So we will just keep our hands moving upward as we push the clay up. You can see I'm continuously moving my hands as they squeeze the clay up. If you don't have enough water or you keep your hands in one part, another common thing that happens is you can kind of just squeeze too much in one part and just decapitate your cone. It's very common. So once we have it coned up, we're gonna cone down. So for coning down, we're gonna use this part of our hand. Multiple people, are any of you in the medical profession? Okay, we've had so many people in the medical profession in the last few sessions, and then someone was like, that's actually called the thenar eminence, which I just learned from doing this, but we're gonna use this, which I previously called the meaty part of your hand. Part of your hand to press the clay down. We're not gonna press it fully straight down. We're gonna press it at a slight angle towards our left hand that's there waiting for the clay. I'll exaggerate how much we're gonna move it over so that you can kind of see that I'm not pressing straight down, but I'm pressing it down towards my left hand, and my left hand is there to receive the clay. And we wanna end with kind of this sort of like a gumdrop shape.
What's the purpose of coning up?
So all of it is part of the centering process to just get all of the clay particles going in the direction that we want, get it all nice to work with. This clay that we'll be working with is fresh out of the bag, but sometimes if we have recycled clay, which we call reclaim, we want to just make sure that it's all incorporated and centered as well as possible. We will center just right now for rule of thumb, we'll cone up and down for rule of thumb twice, but if I had clay that was really hard, for example, I would maybe do it a few more times just to get it a little bit easier to work with. If the clay was super soft, I would maybe just do it once. But yeah, it's all part of getting the clay centered and sort of working in the right direction. So I'll cone up and down one more time. So same thing, pressing down at a slight angle. And then my left hand is there to catch it. If for whatever reason, like say our clay gets pushed off center when we're doing that, very common. So now you can see I have this wobble. We'll just go back to the same thing we did at the very beginning and just push the clay back to center to get rid of that wobble if at any point it gets off center. So now that we have centered it and coned up and down, we are ready to flatten the top. I'm not Canadian, so I feel like this is not an accurate reference size-wise, but I've always just called it a hockey puck because I know a hockey puck is round and flat on the top, but then recently someone told me that's nowhere near the size of a hockey puck. So it's like a personal birthday cake, whatever you want to call it, we're gonna flatten the top of this. So for doing that, we're gonna keep our left hand on the outside and our right hand is gonna come down kind of like a karate chop onto the top of our clay to flatten it out. Your left hand is just staying there to make sure that the diameter of our piece doesn't get wider. So because we're putting downward force, if we just continue to press down on this, it would just flatten into a wide plate if we didn't have something there sort of countering that downward force. So with the wheel spinning, I'm just coming straight down with this part of my hand onto the top. To flatten it into this hockey puck-esque shape. So once we have the top flattened, then we can open our piece. For opening, you want to make sure that you're opening in the exact center of your piece. So what I usually do is sort of with the wheel spinning, run my hands over the top. And with your finger, you can kind of find that exact center point where it's not moving your hand either way. When you're in the exact center, just mark that spot. And then, like with many things in pottery, there's a couple different ways you can open. You can either put your hands on either side and kind of glue your thumbnails together and press straight down. Or what I usually do is keep your left hand on the outside just to keep things stable. Keep your thumbs connected so your hands are working together. And then you're just tipping into that center point that you've just marked and then going straight down. So you're kind of going in at a 45-degree angle until you've started to open, and then you're just going straight down. We will stop when you think you're about 1/2 inch from hitting the wheel head. Then we'll measure, then we'll go a little bit further down, but it's just safer to stop ahead versus like when you feel the metal. We can always add some clay in if that's the case, but just to sort of get a feel for when we're gonna stop. So we're just tilting in. And then going straight down. Then we will measure. To measure, we're going to take the pin tool and hold your finger on it, and then you will go into that hole you've created, and then your finger will be stopped by the clay, and then you'll be able to see the depth. So we'll just go in. That's about, we want it to be about 1/4 inch, which in my case is about the width of my pinky nail, so I always use that as a reference point, but it's about 1/4 inch is where we want to stop. So once we have our piece opened, now we're gonna open it all the way. So we have our...
You don't have to fix the pinhole or anything?
No, that will fill in. So if I just run my finger over it, it'll close right up. But that's a good question, yes. Usually what we'll do is we'll put so much pressure, like we'll always be compressing the bottom, so it will just get filled in, but you can just fill it in immediately. Good question, yeah, we did just make a hole in the bottom of our piece. So now what we'll do is just go into the hole we just created, not going any further down, just stopping at that depth and then pulling straight back towards your belly button. So you want to create a perpendicular connection between the wall and the floor of your piece. So you want to keep your finger perpendicular to the wheel head and come straight back so that you can really get that 90-degree angle with the wall and the floor of your piece. So we're just, same thing that I said before, now we're putting outward pressure, so our left hand is there to just make sure that we don't just keep coming out and like the same thing, get a plate, which is something you can make on the wheel but won't be what we're going for right this second. So we'll just come straight back. So you can see in there, because of how my finger was, I've created a spiral in the bottom. You can just take your sponge and just press down to smooth that out. Okay. So once we have opened our piece, now we're ready to do what is called pulling. So pulling is really the biggest part of what we'll do on the wheel, because it's what gives us the shape and the vertical height of our piece. Most important things to remember for pulling are that your hands work together. Your hands are one tool that will be working together, and that we're gonna move our hands slowly. So for this part, it will be just slow and steady so that we are able to have as controlled of a motion as possible. So we'll have on the outside the sponge held in our right hand. Is anyone left-handed? No? Okay. So we'll hold the sponge in our right hand. That will be our outside point of contact. And then on the inside, we will have 1 or 2 fingertips, depending on what feels least awkward, I guess I should say, instead of most comfortable. But think about one point of contact on the outside and one point of contact on the inside. And you can see that my hands are connected. I always rest my left thumb over my right hand so that my hands are working together. Reason for that is if my hands are completely separated, we're putting pressure from the outside and the inside evenly so that we're pressing the clay in the same spot upward. If my hands are separated and one hand is working over here and one hand's working over here, you're just gonna warp your piece. You want there to be that steady, even pressure on either side so that the walls of your piece are pushed upward and you get that vertical height. There should be, this, which is in all of the handouts, but this gives kind of a visual idea of what we're doing right here. So you can see there's a point of contact on the inside, a point of contact on the outside, and it's pressing the clay upward as we pull up and we get that vertical height. So your hands are going to be moving slowly. The wheel will be moving at a moderate speed, but just think about going up like a millimeter by millimeter. If at any point it feels like something's off, just float your hands away from the wheel. It's easy to be like, whoa, something's weird, and then just kind of move our hands, and then that's when we tend to smash our piece a little bit. So you can stop at any point, just float your hands away from it, and then we can go back and pull again. So we'll make sure that we have water so that there's no friction. So I always just squeeze water on either side. Then we don't touch the clay until the wheel's spinning. So I have my wheel spinning. I'm gonna have my point of contact on the outside, point of contact on the inside. Hands are connected, and I'm just gently and slowly putting pressure to pull the walls upward. You can see I had one part where like the inside was a little bit higher than the outside, but then the walls will join as we pull up. In between pulls, we want to get any water, even though we're going to be putting water on our piece all the time, you always want to take any water that's sitting on the inside of your piece out. You don't want there to be water sitting in there because it can weaken the inside part of your walls and make that a weak point, and also it can lead to S-cracks in the kiln, which I can show you an example of with something in the kiln. You can also compress the rim by putting one finger, well, two fingers from one hand, one on either side on the outside, sort of creating this shape, and then one finger from the other hand on the top, just to smooth out the rim. So we'll pull again. Same thing, slow, even pressure. Take any water out from the inside, compress the bottom. So I'm kind of pressing as I'm doing that. We'll pull again. Until we get the desired height for our piece, or if I say that's probably thin enough, and we'll stop at that point as well. There is a point where it gets too thin, and then it has more likelihood of collapsing. So there is sometimes a point where I'll say, all right, we're not going to pull anymore. So once we get the desired height and thinness of the walls of our piece, then we can shape it however we want. So say I wanted this to be a mug. If I wanted it to have a more rounded shape, then I would just put more pressure from the outside going in to kind of create that shape. If I wanted it to be a bowl, I'll just show both. So if we wanted to curve this in, also this is a good thing. So say for example, we're making our piece and then something happens and it's now no longer perfectly round. One thing that we can do is called collaring, where we'll put both hands and kind of just give it like a gentle hug with both hands on either side to get it back to the shape that we want and kind of just fix that little bump. And we would do the same thing but putting more pressure from the outside in if we wanted to really round this out. If we wanted to create more of a shape like that. If we wanted the opposite effect, we would put pressure from the outside in, just very gentle pressure to open it out. So it's kind of just
Can you, like, is the base diameter kind of set at this point?
at this point, yeah. So what we can do, I did not very efficiently pull all of this clay from here. So the actual diameter, and this is a good thing to do before we take our piece off the wheel. So we're taking this wooden tool and I'm just gonna cut in with this part at the angle of the wall of my piece. So with two hands, with the wheel spinning, I would just go in and take away this excess. And then I'll turn my tool and clear the clay out like this. So that just shows like this will be the diameter of the piece. There was just a little extra sort of skirt on there. If you wanted to open this out more, you could push from the inside here at the bottom if you wanted to make this sort of like the very base diameter won't change, but we could push out from the inside and make this wider all around. And you could really push the inside part out, for example. And then if you wanted to make the top narrower, like if you were making a vase, then you would have that bottom part push out and then you could pull this part in. So you can kind of alter the shape of this part of it, but we won't at this point make it a wider bowl. Or you could widen the walls to where you have a bowl, like a ramen bowl with a narrow base and then wider walls, but the base itself will stay about that size. Good question. So let's say I want this to be, I don't know, a latte mug, which right now it looks maybe like it would be big, but our clay from this point all the way through will shrink. So sometimes people are like, oh, this is huge, and then they see their piece. I don't know if this happened to you in hand building. You saw your piece afterward and you're like, this looks smaller.
It happened to me in the wheel. My latte mug turned into a teacup.
Yeah. So a lot of times when people are like, no, this is way too big, I'm like, that's probably actually a perfect size. So once we've achieved the size or the shape that we want, then we're ready to take it off of the wheel. So this is where I would just clean up any extra, like for example, like what I did down here, any extra clay that's at the bottom. We will trim our pieces, which we'll do next week. So for trimming, we'll really take away any of the excess clay, trim our foot on the bottom. I'll explain all of this, but it's helpful to tidy some of that up beforehand. You could trim it off, but it's just helpful to have that tidied up a little bit beforehand. So then we will, any questions about this part?
You said it originally you were going kind of straight down and now you've kind of tucked in. Are you going, is there like a minimum quarter-inch thickness again for when you're cutting in a little bit?
For
Just
the
with
walls?
the wooden tool. Yeah, the base when you were trimming.
Oh, yeah, so it would just be whatever angle you want. So yeah, that's a great question. If you wanted it to be like a perfectly straight angle with the outside wall, the outside and like the wall, then yeah, you would hold this completely straight. I just, given that I curved this, then decided aesthetically I wanted it to curve in a little bit at the bottom.
My eyes.
So I
that's
just
right.
So I just angled it. But no, that's a great question. Depending on how you hold the tool will create whatever that angle is. And when we trim it, I could even round this out more next week. Yeah.
So would it be at the like hockey puck stage where you would decide how, you know,
Yeah.
your diameter of your piece basically?
Exactly. So at that point, right now we'll all work with about this diameter just to get a feel. But yeah, if you wanted it to be wider, then you would flatten the whole piece out wider. Yeah, before we started pulling. That's a great question. Any other ones? No. Okay, so once we have it how we want it, we will cut it off the wheel. So for this, we have this wire tool. We just want to have it as flush with the wheel head as possible, and then we're just pulling straight back, keeping it flat, straight back towards your belly button again. This is a point where if you had a very thin base to your piece and you perhaps were unaware of that, you will find out because you will see the wire going through. So it can be a moment where we can kind of say, oh, okay, I need to be cognizant of the fact that the base of this is thin for next week when we trim, so we don't trim through. So just to take note, if when we're trimming, we do trim through, you just have a plant pot with drainage, so it's not the end of the world, but we like to always be cognizant of if that might be the case so that we don't forget the next week and then accidentally trim through. So after we have wired it off, we'll take these pot lifters, or someone in the last class like to call them pot tongs, whatever you want to call them. They will be what we'll use to lift our piece off the wheel. You're just going to go under, so I dip them in the water first. You're just going to go under enough that you're able to lift up. They don't need to go all the way. They definitely don't need to overlap. So once we can lift it up, we will just place it onto our wear board here, and then we're all set to let that dry until we trim it. Take a picture of your piece, because I always say trimming is transformational. Between this stage and once we've trimmed it, it can really change a lot. I will clean this wheel off now, but just to know, when we are first starting with our first piece that we're throwing, like in any throwing session, you want the wheel to be clean and dry so that you don't have, like I was saying before, any water underneath your clay that can get it, can keep it from having that good seal. But the nice thing is, if you're sitting down and you're gonna throw, I don't know, 10 mugs or something like that, once you have this little circle of clay, you can just throw your next piece right onto this little circle of clay, and it will just adhere to this, which is really nice. You wouldn't have to clean it every single time in between pieces. I will clean it now so that everyone can start with a fresh wheel, but just so you know.